Rene is 26 years older than you.
That's right.
Did it bother you then? Does it bother you now?
Never did, never will. Rene is the most fantastic, who loves me. Nobody will ever love me as much as this. It was hard for my mom. It's been hard because my mom always wanted to protect me. He's been married 2 times before. He's got 3 children. Come on, Celine. I want the Prince of Charm for you. And now I come with a man 26 years older than me. It's not the perfect scenario, but what is perfect?
Is it the same way today with you and Rene?
It's even better.
Really?
Because I get to know him better, and I cannot wait to get to know the husband better. And that's another one of the reasons why I want to stop.
Let us hope that he lives to be 125. But
thank you.
There may come a time when you are on your own and you've had all this protection.
Yes.
Will you be okay?
I'll be fine.
Rene Angelil was born on January 16, 1942, in Montreal, Quebec, Canada, to parents Joseph and Alice. His father, Joseph, was born in Syria and then relocated to Paris, where he worked in the City of Lights as a tailor. When the Second World War broke out, Joseph fled to Canada, where he entered into an arranged marriage with family friend Alice Sarah. Though 16 years older than Alice, Joseph eagerly accepted the arrangement. In the book titled Rene Angelil, The Making of Celine Dion, the authors write, quote, "Much could be said about the matrimonial arrangements of those earlier days, but when Joseph first saw this 23-year-old beauty, he had no desire to question the arrangement between the two families. Even though there was a gap of 16 years between them, Joseph swore to be faithful to her and love her for the rest of his life. Upon their marriage, the couple settled into a small, modest home where they welcomed 2 sons, Rene and his younger brother Andre. Joseph Angelil wasn't a man of many words, as he was often described to be uncommunicative, cold, distant, and stern. Nevertheless, he was a passionate man who was an artist at heart. He had a powerful voice and sang in his church choir, a church that consisted of Christians from the Middle East. They write, "Joseph was a man of principles and traditions, a very religious and reticent man. Though active, high-strung, and quick-tempered, he imposed his Arab culture on his family."
Je suis de descendance syrienne. Je suis né ici au Québec, mais mes parents sont nés à Damas, en Syrie. Je suis un arabe.
Jusqu'à l'âge de 5 ans ou 6 ans, quand j'ai commencé à aller à l'école. Avant ça, je parlais arabe. J'ai du sang arabe en dedans. Puis quand je vois les guerres qui se passent dans les pays arabes, comment ils se chicanent tout le temps, puis ils se battent tout le temps. Des fois, je me surprends à penser que moi, je suis comme ça aussi en dedans. J'ai le sang bouillant. Je suis capable de me fâcher comme ça.
Rene grew up in a very traditional household. His family didn't have a lot of money and struggled to make ends meet. Since his father was the financial provider, he was quite absent emotionally. The authors write, "As he grew up, Rene would be the subject above all to female influences, and especially that of his mother Alice, the woman of his life, with whom he would develop an unfailing understanding. Rene was also influenced by his grandmother Sarah, an enthusiastic gambler. By the time Rene reached adolescence, he had a keen understanding on how the world worked. Though a bright student, he found himself bored at school and desired more. He excelled in card games long before he learned algebra or geometry, and he wanted to take on the real world, real life with real stakes." The authors write, "He had already worked out where the real power lay in his family. There was no doubt it was with the women. It was his mother he would confide in when things went wrong or he got off the rails. His mother would always understand him. His father maintained distance between himself and those around him, and in any case, Rene wanted to cross those boundaries Joseph had set for him." Joseph would often say that his son Rene was going to be an accountant or a lawyer. Rene, however, had other plans in mind. When he became a teenager, he discovered something far more alluring. He discovered America. Most importantly, Quebec. It was 1952 when television made its appearance in Canadian households. Rene became engulfed with American culture, as it was on the radio, in magazines, on records and introduced him to artists such as Sammy Davis, Dean Martin, Jerry Lewis, and Elvis Presley, to name a few. Instead of pursuing the life his father mapped out, Rene began to pursue his musical talents. Like his father, he had a nice voice and sang in the choir growing up. In addition to being a skilled singer, Rene had an excellent musical ear. Eventually, he and his childhood friend Pierre decided to enroll in an amateur talent contest after being inspired by the Elvis Presley phenomenon. They write, in 1958, the popularity of amateur contests was comparable to the many improvs of today. All the radio stations had to include in their programming a show during which undiscovered talents competed for the top prize. We could well call this exploitation in the worst sense of the word, since none of these aspiring talents were paid, and the generously sponsored program awarded the winner only a $20 watch. But what did it matter? All the participants dreamed of fame, and Pierre and Rene decided to give it their best shot. For in 1958 and a long time after, amateur talent contests were the professional springboard for launching a career. The duo would welcome brothers Jean and Gilles to the group where they formed the band The Baronets. The Baronets would enter into various contests and almost always take home the first prize. In 1960, they negotiated their first professional gig and performed at a popular nightclub. Right before the performance, Rene had to tell his parents that he had dropped out of college and wanted to pursue show business. His father, Joseph, was beyond devastated and shocked. They write, though Joseph went to the Baronet's first professional show, where he applauded and smiled, his dream had been shattered. Communication between the two would become difficult from then on, and Rene would suffer from his father's oppressive silence for years.
I started in the show business. I was 19 years old. I was part of the group. We were like the French Beatles. Of course, I had a lot of hair.
I heard about it, but he didn't tell me directly. I think he was probably too ashamed to.
He was excellent, by the way. Was one of the famous band in the 60s.
The Baronets picked up some steam and quickly became known in Quebec. Gilles would leave the group and stick to his day job while the remaining members performed on the evenings and weekends. With their newfound recognition, Rene became more confident in himself and the band, and soon became the leader of the group who liked being in charge. Former member Jean said, I soon found out that Rene liked to be in charge. He liked to dominate. From the outset and during all the years where we were baronets, we used to fight. I can't stand being dominated by anyone, and neither can he. But we did respect one another. It didn't stop us from having some good times together. I was the only one who stood up to him in his entire life. No one could dominate him. Pierre had a docile temperament and went along with whatever Rene said. When Rene was set on an idea, he could defend it for hours on end, and that's how he developed his debating skills. He always wanted to be a winner. The fear of losing was a constant obsession with him. He never stopped telling us he was going to win, as if it was the end of the world for him to lose.
Moi, je pense que ce qu'il a fait là, depuis 10, 12 ans, depuis 15 ans, c'est très fort.
Il y a une oreille magique et un œil magique. C'est un homme que quand il discute avec quelqu'un, il est capable de l'écouter, mais il va être tellement laconique dans ce qu'il va dire après, il n'en parlera pas longtemps. Mais ça va tellement... Il pèse tellement fort quand il dit quelque chose que les gens font « Oh, Rene Angelil a parlé ».
Rene made it his mission to take the band as far as possible. He helped the band secure a manager, record their first demo, and arrange for them to play at several venues. The public really took a liking to the group as they had great stage presence. In December of 1963, the Baronets would listen to a record from a new band who were all the rage in England. That band was the Beatles. After being inspired by the Beatles, the Baronets would go through a radical transformation and receive a Beatles cut, with the hair falling over their foreheads. They wore colorful jackets and had their pictures taken running and jumping in the streets of Montreal. The authors write, they toured all the radio stations, organized autographing sessions in department stores, canvassed the media, and in no time at all became the most popular group in Quebec. Very soon, hysterical girls were packing the houses where the Baronets were performing, screaming and jockeying for position, some of them fainting at the sight of their idols.
Oui, mais demain, je retourne à la guerre, car la guerre est chose nécessaire. Toute la nuit.
That year, in 1963, the Baronets, who had barely earned $60 a week when they first began, were now taking in more than $2,000 each and were buying new cars almost every month. They write, intoxicated by their burgeoning fame, the lads spent madly, without any thought for the future. What did wealth mean to them when they were loved, adulated, and feted everywhere they went, and were even able to provoke riots? This fancy lifestyle that fame offered was something Rene desired ever since he was a little boy. He wanted to live the high life and wouldn't settle for anything less.
He was part of a very famous trio called Les Baronets.
They were superstars in Quebec. They were quite huge.
For 12 years, we toured everywhere. We were like the French Beatles, you know?
As their popularity grew, so did Rene's plans for the group. He wanted the Baronets, who were very popular in Quebec, to cross over to the American market. But as tension began to fester within the group, those goals would be hard to achieve. They write, by the end of 1965, there were reports in the specialized press about the increasingly tense atmosphere between the members of the Baronets. Due to the conflict, they would split up briefly, but later reconcile, though the group was never the same, nor regain the popularity they once had. With the future of his band unclear, Rene spent a lot of time prancing around town with various women. He was a charismatic man who often got his way with the ladies. In 1966, at the age of 24, he secretly married his longtime girlfriend Denise, a woman who he had been unfaithful to many times before. Due to Rene's celebrity status, he kept his personal life private and didn't even share with his friends his plans to marry. They write, the marriage was celebrated in the strictest privacy, with only his family members present, after they had been sworn to complete secrecy. Even if he was still in love with Denise, Rene didn't see why he had to marry her, but he didn't have any choice. His father, who had never accepted his son's cohabitation, kept up the pressure for the union to be normalized. Rene had always found excuses to gain time and postpone the day, but he suddenly ran out of arguments. His father was 63 years old, and he didn't want to disappoint him yet again. Though Rene's forced marriage threatened to interrupt his womanizing ways, it wouldn't prevent him from cheating. He was a ladies' man and craved attention. After the death of his father in 1967, Rene and his wife Denise welcomed a son named Patrick on January 28, 1968. Upon the birth of his son, Rene was too distracted with gambling and was no longer emotionally invested in the group, now that their fame had declined drastically. Though he put on a brave face, Rene's confidence heavily relied on the success of his band, and without that success, he struggled immensely. Jean, a former baronet, said, for the first time, I understood that Rene felt lost. The Baronets were his security blanket. He lacked confidence in himself and his abilities. Jean would cut ties with the Baronets, leaving only Rene and Pierre to perform as a duo. Together, they would appear in a few comedy movies to dismal ratings. His career wasn't where he wanted it to be, and neither was his personal life. Rene had tried his luck in performing, but his time was up. He tried his luck in gambling, but racked up more debt than wins that his mother would have to pay off. Rene was a college dropout with a wife and baby to support, and he didn't have a lot of options, except one. His last resort and card to play was to become a manager.
Right away, I started producing some artists, managing artists.
In 1969, Rene reconnected with a childhood friend named Guy Cloutier. Guy was a producer-manager who had several artists under contract. Rene started working for Guy and learned the ins and outs of how to properly manage an artist. One of the artists under Guy's management was 19-year-old Canadian pop singer Anne Rene. After being introduced to Anne in June of that year, 27-year-old Rene was smitten and took a particular interest in her career. Eventually, the two began an affair.
tout te semble triste et que plus rien ne va. Si tu cherches un ami, pense à moi. Pense à moi.
They write, the affair had gone on for several years before it occurred to Rene to get a divorce from Denise. He was madly in love with Anne, but he was married with a 5-year-old son. In the end, Denise filed for divorce from Rene in 1972. He would then go on to marry Anne in 1973, and later welcome a son together on March 23, 1974, exactly 9 months after they were married. Rene still had dreams of crossing over to the American market and gaining international success. Though his band, the Baronets, never achieved those goals, Rene didn't give up on them. After leaving Guy Cloutier's management and production company, Rene branched out on his own with the help and support of his wife, Anne. With his new career as a manager, Rene was on a hunt to find the artist that could and would give him the success he craved. Rene would manage Ginette Renaud. It was 1977, and she was in the market for a new manager. At this point, Rene didn't have many options and needed an artist that could take him far. They write, he was thinking of his family and future and was convinced that Ginette was the key to winning recognition as a manager and respect from his peers. Indeed, she was the lucky break he'd been waiting for.
On était excités tous les deux de travailler ensemble. D'ailleurs, le plus gros album que j'ai fait de ma vie, Je ne suis qu'une chanson, c'est avec lui que je l'ai fait. Je voulais pas faire Je ne suis qu'une chanson, je voulais pas faire Ça va mieux. Je disais c'est des chansons pour la scène, il disait non, on va les mettre sur l'album. C'est un homme qui il a toujours pas mal su où est-ce qu'il s'en allait.
J'avais un plan, le même plan qui a servi à Céline.
En fait, vous aviez déjà bâti le plan de Céline avec Ginette Renaud.
Absolument.
Et vous étiez prêt pour aller à la guerre.
On était très prêts, tout était prêt. Ça faisait 1 an qu'on travaillait là-dessus. J'avais été rencontré Eddie Marné, j'avais fait venir au Québec pour écouter Ginette Renaud. Il lui avait composé 12 chansons. J'avais fait une entente avec une maison de disques française, un associé français. Il y avait un plan de marketing, tout était prêt.
Mais moi, je ne suis qu'une chanson, ni plus ni moins qu'un morceau de passion.
Rene began working on his new protege and quickly had insane success with her. Her single that he convinced her to do sold a total of 350,000 copies. With the success, he spared no effort and had Ginette booked for tours, TV appearances, and so on. The sky was the limit. But unbeknownst to Rene, there was a problem. Ginette wasn't as excited about these endeavors. In fact, she began reevaluating everything. They write, she claimed to be suffering from fatigue and was thinking more about the upcoming holiday with her boyfriend than about pursuing a career in France. Everything had changed in Ginette's world. She had found the man of her life and wasn't about to sacrifice him to her career. Her boyfriend intervened, demanding a share managing her and the 20% commission that came with it. Rene refused that deal.
C'est justement la passion qui l'emporte. Ginette Renaud et Angelil ne voient pas les choses de la même façon. Même si la stratégie est au point, la chanteuse fait faux bond à son manager.
À cause de son compagnon du temps qui... Souvent, quand on mêle le plaisir et les affaires, ça ne fonctionne pas. Dans ce cas-là, c'est peut-être pas le plaisir, là, parce qu'ils étaient assez intimes, là, les deux. Mais Ginette... tu sais, Ginette, c'est une femme de cœur, puis qui a beaucoup d'amour dans d'elle, puis c'est pour ça qu'elle chante comme ça, d'ailleurs.
Je suis une personne très émotive. Donc, je marche beaucoup avec les émotions. Je marche aussi avec l'amour. J'ai pas toujours... Lui, c'est un homme qui est capable... Il est capable de les mettre de côté.
In the end, Ginette would choose her lover over her career, and she and Rene would part ways. This was a huge blow. They write, suddenly, everything was disappearing into thin air. Months of work, his biggest dreams as a manager, his contacts, his job, and his money. All that was left was his wife who supported him, his 3 children, and a few friends. Rene was on the verge of 40 and was at his lowest point in life.
Ça n'a pas voulu se faire avec Ginette. C'était très grave pour René qui n'avait qu'une artiste et qui avait une famille.
Avez-vous l'impression d'être humilié parce qu'on vous met de côté après avoir bâti une pareille stratégie?
J'ai pas avoir l'impression, j'étais humilié d'avoir été mis de côté par Ginette et son amant, surtout par l'influence de son amant. J'avais eu des déboires aussi avec d'autres projets artistiques et c'était le moment peut-être le plus bas de ma carrière. Je laissais ma carrière.
From Ginette's point of view, she claims that though Rene was a great businessman and secured several deals for her, he railroaded her and overworked her to the point of exhaustion. She said, quote, "Managers expose their stars too much and only think about getting more and more engagements so they can make as much money as possible. That's the way they burn out their artists and shorten careers." Rene had a reputation as being someone who likes complete control, and Ginette didn't want to be controlled. Now with the dissolution of their contract, Rene fell into a slump as he felt he had played his last card and lost big time. He was 39 and had hit rock bottom. By 1981, he was broke, in debt, ambitionless, and was growing increasingly paranoid that the ship to have international success had sailed. But one day, out of the blue, Rene would receive a call about a 12-year-old girl from Charlemagne, who apparently had an extraordinary voice. She would be his meal ticket and pathway to international success. And that girl was 12-year-old Celine Dion. Celine Dion was born on March 30th, 1968, in Charlemagne, Quebec, to parents Adamar and Therese. She was the last of 14 children. In her authorized biography, the authors write, "Families of 10, 15, or 20 children now are rare, but up until the Second World War, large families were common."
First, our dad, Adhémar. Mom, Thérèse, Denise, Clément, Claudette, Liette, Michel, Louise, Jacques, Daniel, Ghislaine, Linda, Manon, Paul, Pauline, those are twins, and Celine.
From the moment Celine was born, she was the apple of her family's eye. Though her presence brought much joy, it also brought pain and resentment. Celine writes, "I was born on March 30th, 1968. I was a mistake, an accident, and the cause of a serious quandary for my mother. The day she learned she was pregnant, she had to relinquish plans she'd been cherishing a long time. I was in no way a part of these plans. My birth was unwanted and unexpected. By coming into the world, I crushed her dreams. I've always loved her so much that if I had known this, I think I would not have been able to let myself be born. My mother had already brought up 13 children. For more than 20 years, she'd kept house. She did the washing and the housework, the cleaning, the ironing, the meals, and she did it all over and over again, during good times and bad times, 365 days a year. My mother believed that at long last, she would be able to do something else. She had gone so far as to see the priest, to ask him if she could stop having children, as they said at the time, which meant using contraceptives. At the time, the priest of Quebec had a lot of authority. This one began preaching to her. He told her she didn't have the right to defy nature. I imagine that despite herself, at the bottom of her heart, she held my being born against me a bit.
I was educated in another time, an era where the women stayed at home and took care of the household. I wanted to have a bunch of kids because we were happy in my home. I said I'd like to have 5. However, sometimes the husband isn't always in agreement because he said, "Well, me, I don't want any at all."
After 25 years as a full-time housewife and mother, Mrs. Dion was ready to try something different.
And she said to herself, when the kids start school, I'm going to go and work and I'm going to go to meet the world for the first time and I'm going to go and have friends. I can't stand to be between 4 walls of my life anymore. And the day that the kids started school, she found out she was pregnant of me. I think it was a very dramatic situation for my mom.
Celine's parents had limited education and were quite poor. They lived in a tiny house with not enough space for everyone. The youngest would sleep in drawers as they utilized every ounce of space in their minuscule house. Celine's father was an inspector for a meatpacking company and didn't make much money. To bring in additional income, he, along with his wife and children, started a family band where they would go around town playing at various events, such as weddings and family get-togethers. Everyone in their family was musically gifted. Early on, Celine's family took note of her amazing voice. Too young to join the family band, Celine would make her first public singing appearance at her brother Michel's wedding on August 18, 1973, when she was just 5 years old. After years of working at the meatpacking company, her father bought a restaurant called the Old Barrel, where the family would perform. They write, "For years, the Dion children sang there. At the beginning, though, it was another story. The place was practically deserted. Paul, who was 15 by then, decided to buy an electric organ and start playing there to create a little atmosphere. The Old Barrel quickly became a popular meeting place. Celine faced her first audiences there and had her first public successes on its stage. Though Celine gained much confidence and pleasure in performing, school was a different story. Unfortunately, it was a place where Celine didn't quite fit in. She felt that she couldn't relate to her classmates, as she spent most of her time with older people. Because she frequented her parents' restaurant and watched the late-night live shows, she would often show up to school exhausted and could barely keep her eyes open. Her teacher said, quote, "It was like she was from another planet. She didn't talk much, she didn't mix with the other kids, she couldn't follow the rest of the class, and learned almost nothing."
I had a hard and bad time at school. You have to try to imagine when every day of your life there's music, incredible food, smells so good. In the basement of the house, there's your 13 brothers and sisters playing instruments, singing, getting ready for their new show. And school, for me, they were taking me away from what I loved the most, from my happiness, from the smell of my mom, her clothes, her warmth, the food, the music, the happiness, my family that I love.
At the age of 11, Celine told her mother that she wanted to be a singer and was no longer interested in school. Mrs. Dion had dreams of being a singer herself and had tried to get her older children into show business without much success. With Celine, however, she felt she had the right ingredients. She told Celine that if she wanted to be a singer, it had to be professionally. No singing in clubs or in their bar. She wanted Celine to be a star. Celine writes, "By the time I was 12 years old, Mom already had big plans for me. She wanted to make me into the kind of singer who would pack stadiums in Montreal and who could tour Quebec and Canada for several months at a time. She wanted me to be like Ginette Reneau, who had become one of Canada's most popular singers." Upon having a family meeting, Celine would sign a 5-year contract with talent agent Paul Levesque on December 5, 1980. Celine writes, "After a family conference, my parents signed with him. Paul was less than 30, but he was a responsible and meticulous man who was very law-abiding and respectful of conventional values. Paul immediately set out to find a record company and producer for Celine, but he wasn't moving fast enough for Mrs. Dion. She felt that he wasn't aggressive nor persistent enough in managing Celine's career, which caused the parties to clash." Celine writes, "Paul was kind of culturally incompatible with our family. He was astonished, not to say horrified, by our very bohemian artistic lifestyle. For example, he was shocked that I often missed school without anyone at home being bothered by it."
You stopped going to school in order to pursue your career. If Rene Charles comes to you at 14 and says, "Mom, I want to stop going to school. I want to be a musician." What do you say to him?
I would probably try to make a deal with him because I suffer today from not being able to write as well as I would love to.
Really?
Yes, I think I write better in English than in French. French language is very difficult.
I don't miss anything about school because I still believe today that school is not for everybody. I've had a hard time in school. I could never incorporate myself with other children.
I mean, you were teased, in fact.
I was not looking so good. I had teeth problems. I was very skinny. They thought I was an abused child. They sent somebody home.
Did I understand you to say that at one point they actually thought that you'd been an abused child because
At
you were
school,
so skinny?
I was very skinny and I was not playing, I was being pushed and I was not pushing back. So they said, she's not normal. I was not a talker, I was a dreamer.
When Celine dropped out of school, Paul was not pleased. The Dions and Paul didn't see eye to eye on several things, but one thing they did agree on was that Celine needed to record a demo in order to get herself out there. In the spring of 1981, Celine would record a song that her mother wrote for her.
Dans un grand jardin enchanté, tout à coup je me suis retrouvée.
Un peu des violons jouaient, au ciel les anges me souriaient, le vent soufflait d'été.
The first song that my mom wrote me started my life. Got me here today. So they can never be a more important song than that.
Paul would send the demo out to various music executives hoping to get a deal. But after a few months, nothing. Frustrated with Paul's lack of success, Mrs. Dion took matters into her own hands. They write, she always had a very clear idea of what show business was. When she felt Celine was ready, she approached the man who she considered to be the most important producer and the best manager. And that man was Rene Angelil.
They sent the tape to Rene Angelil. Rene was a successful record producer in Quebec, but had just lost his most important client.
One day I was in my office depressed. All of a sudden I get this tape with a red ribbon over it, and it's written 12 years old, so I didn't listen to it right away.
So my brother called him. And he said, Mr. Angelil, we know that you didn't listen to the tape because you would have called right away.
I listened to it, and I was amazed. I was shocked at that voice.
Rene would call Celine's brother back immediately and request that they come in. They write, they set a meeting for the same afternoon. Around 2 o'clock, Celine showed up with her mother. She was a tiny little thing, painfully shy, badly dressed, not very pretty, with buck teeth, a pointy chin, and very thick eyebrows. Rene spoke to her gently. The little girl said, hoping to please him, that her favorite singer was Ginette Renew, and that she knew all Renew's songs by heart, and that she'd even seen her once live. After an exchange of pleasantries, Rene would instruct Celine to sing live, a cappella.
And I said, well, I'm used to sing with a microphone, you know? And he said, well, I'll give you my pen. Just imagine, pretend it's a microphone. And he says, when you sing for me, a cappella, no music, nothing. Just pretend you're on stage and you see balconies and you look at the people, you know.
And I was so touched, and at the end I was crying. And, you know, everything changed since that day. She had talent, obviously. She was 12 years old with a fantastic voice.
The authors continued, quote, he sat there at his desk and couldn't believe his eyes or his ears. That little girl had everything, the instincts, a powerful voice, a presence. Rene started to cry. The voice he heard was incredibly touching. He was so impressed that when the girl stopped singing, he couldn't even speak or remember her name. He told Mrs. Dion, if you trust me, I guarantee you that in 5 years, your daughter will be a big star in Quebec and France. Mrs. Dion agreed that her daughter had star quality and accepted Rene's deal, but there was a problem. Celine already had a manager, and Rene was not too thrilled about that. The authors write, Mrs. Dion was an ambitious and impatient woman. She constantly nagged Paul to launch her daughter into show business as quickly as possible. But weeks and months went by without Paul showing much sign of life. Rene had stumbled upon an uncut gem, a real jewel, and moved quickly to charm her family, since he knew Mrs. Dion wasn't too pleased with Paul's services. They write, he lost no time in going to see Celine's parents in her small town, accompanied by his wife. Rene, the seducer, set to work and charmed all Celine's family members, especially her mother.
Rene seduced the family.
Il était venu à la maison. He came to the house. My mother told us, this is Mr. Angelil. He is going to take care of Celine's career.
There was, I'd say, a social difference between Rene and the Dion. They were living in a small suburb. They were not very educated. And Rene was speaking a few languages. He had traveled the world. He had a big car, and he knew New York, Las Vegas. He was a gambler. He was very glamour for that.
Je pense que
Rene had great plans for Celine. Everybody fell under the spell of Rene Angelil. Everybody, the whole family.
When Rene Angelil arrived in the picture, Mom was very, very happy. There was one restriction on that contract. She has to be with Celine everywhere.
When Rene entered Celine's life, Paul considered him to be the best qualified producer to record Celine's first album due to his success with Ginette Renault. However, Paul was still her manager and wanted to proceed slowly and protect the 12-year-old. Paul said, quote, "I wanted to manage Celine's career, but not to the detriment of her personal life. I thought that at her age, she should be in school. But that didn't seem to bother her mother, who wanted to push her daughter into show business. It didn't seem right to me. So I insisted Celine go back to school." Rene could see perfectly that Celine had no interest in school and wanted only to be a singer. This suited him very well, for it meant he could shape a budding artist in his own image, exerting total control over her career without ever having to put up with interference from lovers or possessive husbands. It was very close to the fantasy of middle-aged men who dream of preparing, rearing, and molding a very young girl to be their masterpiece.
There are people who say that you totally control, totally dominate the relationship professionally and personally. Do you agree with that?
No. People, I'll tell you, people that know us, that are around us, they know exactly what's happening.
You're not a control freak.
I'm not a control freak.
Are you a Svengali?
Look, I love what I do. When she was 12, 13, 14, 15, with the experience I had in this business, she counted on that.
The adults in Celine's life began cultivating her into the star we see today. Before she even had a record out, Celine's name and family was in the press, with her first press conference taking place in the spring of 1981. They enrolled Celine in drama classes to broaden her range, and Anne Rene, Rene's wife, took Celine under her wing, showing her the ins and outs of show business. The media were interested in Rene's then 13-year-old protege, and he soon felt the pressure. He knew that to sustain the attention of the media, they needed to start working on Celine's album, and fast. But there was a problem. In order to make a record, you need money, and Rene had none. There are two versions of what Rene supposedly did to finance Celine's first two albums. The first version is as follows.
I hear this voice that comes to me, that sounds to me like the voice of coming from God, you know. Such a great voice that I played my last chips. And in order to play your last chips, you really have to play your last chips. And my last chips was my house.
Instinctively, Rene knew she was going to be a superstar. All he had to do was get that first album made.
They all said, let's start with a single. We'll see how it goes. And of course, it's the sensible thing to do. But I really wanted to go all the way and prove that she was something special. And when nobody wanted to invest that kind of money, I had to mortgage my house, which I did. And we proved that she was something special.
In Celine's unauthorized biography, the authors have a different version. According to them, Rene did not mortgage his house, as his house already had a mortgage on it, and creditors turned him down due to his bad credit. Instead, they claimed that Rene's friend and colleague, Dennis, gave him $30,000 to fund Celine's first two albums. They interviewed Dennis, who worked at TransCanada, Celine's record label, and this is what he had to say. Quote, "It's true. Rene was having a difficult time financially. He didn't mortgage his house, for I was the one who let him have the money to produce Celine's album. He had no business in his own name, and he was so broke, I had to buy him a pair of jeans when he traveled to France with Celine. But I believed in his plan. First of all, because he's a marketing genius, and also because he had an ace up his sleeve, Eddie Marnay. Marnay was a songwriter with a big reputation. In Europe, songwriters have much more influence than they do here, so I knew he could really help Celine's career in Europe. At the time, he saw Celine as a future Barbra Streisand. After securing the funds to record Celine's albums, Rene would book her on various TV programs to promote the teenager. When she opened her mouth to sing, the audience were blown away by such a young talent. After her performances, Rene would make Celine watch them back. They write, Celine didn't like what she saw. Her teeth were too long, her eyebrows too thick, her nose too big, and she didn't project a particularly warm image.
I was not a good-looking girl. I had teeth problem. I wouldn't have money to fix my teeth. I was extremely skinny. It isn't all it seems. I wasn't tough. I wasn't pretty. I wasn't certainly cool. And I felt that all that was against me. So I really had a hard time. And I didn't really feel pretty at all. To ugly duckling girls like me.
To help with Celine's transformation, Rene enlisted the help of his wife, Anne. They would do simulated interviews. Anne reminded Celine that sometimes the interviewer wasn't very good and that she'd have to take the initiative. She'd have to say what she wanted to say, even if no one asked her, in order to get her message across. Anne also took Celine to clothing stores and hair salons to help her overcome her insecurities. Additionally, Rene would make sure to constantly shower the teenager with compliments. When Celine's first album came out, it did great, thrusting her right into the spotlight and making Rene extremely proud. Though satisfied with her success, he still had a fish to fry. Paul, Celine's manager. He and Paul would constantly clash as they didn't see eye to eye on how to manage Celine. In the end, Rene needed to get Paul out of Celine's life for good. To do that, he would buy Celine out of her 5-year contract with Paul and settle outside of court for an undisclosed amount.
Et donc, il m'annonce qu'il ne veut plus que je sois son partenaire. Et il me dit, occupe-toi des disques, je vais m'occuper du management. Et c'est justement ça que je voulais pas, parce que le plus important dans la carrière de l'artiste, c'est le manager, c'est le management. C'est lui qui décide de tout, c'est lui qui prend toutes les décisions, c'est lui qui va former ton équipe, c'est lui qui va te mettre en contact avec les meilleures personnes dans le métier. Et il n'en était pas question. Bon, puis là, à la dernière minute, j'ai dit, écoute, il faut que tu signes l'entente. Et c'est là que j'ai vu ses couleurs. Là, il m'a dit non, moi, je veux garder le management, occupe-toi des disques. Alors là, je lui ai annoncé officiellement qu'il y avait 48 heures pour tenir sa parole puis faire ce qu'il avait dit. Sinon, lui, il n'était plus dans le portrait du tout.
Alors, vous l'avez tassé?
Oui, absolument.
Puis là, c'était un cas de ça passe ou ça casse, mais il y en a juste un qui passe dans la porte.
Absolument.
To Rene, he needed to be in total control of Celine's career. That was the only way. He once said, quote, "That's the first thing you have to get. If you don't have control, then you're just carrying out other people's orders. That doesn't appeal to me."
Jusqu'à aujourd'hui, Paul Lévesque, qui est maintenant l'impresario de Bruno Pelletier, refuse de commenter l'épisode. Il nous a simplement dit que personne ne voudrait croire la vérité et qu'il garde son histoire pour un livre qui pourrait être publié aux États-Unis. Diriez-vous qu'en affaires, vous êtes un dur?
Oui. En affaires, je suis dur, c'est certain. Mais j'ai une parole, puis je suis straight, je joue franc jeu, mais je sais compter.
With Celine all to himself now, Rene opened his own company, called TBS Productions, on March 30th, 1982, Celine's 14th birthday. They write, Anne was the president and sole owner of this company, while Rene was an employee. She gave up her job as a host of a TV show to devote herself to production and managing artists. Moreover, she was close friends with Celine, to whom she taught the rudiments of fashion, makeup, and poise, while advising her in her dealings with the media. In the end, Anne would have a large influence on Celine's career, greatly increasing Celine's self-confidence. Celine's career continued to flourish over the next 2 years, but on January 23, 1983, Rene was obligated to declare personal bankruptcy with debts of $257,000. The author's right. It became obvious then why he had to put TBS in Anne Renee's name. The company hadn't incurred any debts and wasn't connected to Rene, who was merely his wife's unpaid employee. Though Rene's finances were in a dire situation, Celine's popularity was on the rise. Eddie Marnay, Celine's songwriter and producer, would write several hit songs for the teen that were specifically catered to Celine personally. In order to do that, he had to spend a lot of time with the teenager, watching and observing her every move. He said, quote, Celine may have been 14, but she was very mature for her age. She had always mixed with older people than her. She was very close to her family. She was well known in Quebec, and with her career came a highly organized, busy professional life. Yet, when it came to real experiences, she was still a very protected little girl. She had no way of expressing herself or analyzing what was happening inside her. Celine was a well-behaved girl who found comfort in her elders, especially Rene. And Rene, a man who liked to be in control, made a huge impact on the impressionable Celine. Celine soon became the breadwinner in her family, making more money in a month than her father made in a year. The Dions felt grateful towards Rene and spoke highly of him to others. They constantly praised and complimented him to be an intelligent, charismatic man who was able to help their family like no one had done before.
Rene, what did you see in Celine when she came to you as a 12-year-old child that made you think she could be a star?
Well, you have to understand that at that time I was 39 years old. I had been in this business for 20 years, and things weren't so great for me. So she came in the office with her mother, and she was singing. Her voice was like a voice of an angel. Really, I had chills. She got me.
Take me back to those early years, the youngest child in a family of 14.
That's right.
Now you live in a marble palace. Then you slept, what, 4 in a room?
We used to sleep like 3, 4 people in the same bed. Yes. But it was wonderful times. It was, money-wise, it was hard. We never knew what was going to eat. But with my mother, we were not afraid. She always found solutions. She's wonderful. She's my idol. I look up to her. My dad was the hard worker one. My mom raised us with nothing. And when you talk to her, they haven't been to school. They didn't know how to write. I was ashamed of that. My parents cannot write. They make mistakes when they write. Well, today it's my turn. I make mistakes, but I love them.
And these days you can take care of them. That must be a great joy.
Yeah.
Rene was the big shot who got the Dions out of poverty through Celine, so when it came to her career, the sky was the limit. Celine was doing well in the market, but Rene believed she could do better. Though her albums did well, they didn't exceed Ginette Renou's album sales when Rene managed her. Internally, that was a war he was up against. He needed Celine to outsell Ginette in order to recover from his bruised ego. This became his obsession. He said, quote, "If you want something to happen, you have to believe in it. You have to talk it up. You have to act as if it couldn't not happen. You have to be absolutely convinced that things are going to happen just the way you say they are." When I said that Celine was going to be a star, I never doubted it for a moment. Doubt is your worst enemy. It destroys you. A manager has to believe and make other people believe. If I look after her future, I'll be looking after my own. Rene's obsession of making Celine into a global star would begin to interfere in his marriage to Anne. They write, he was more and more obsessed with Celine's career. It took all of his time and energy, and all of his money. He was often on the road, especially in France. But even when he was back in Montreal, he saw his children rarely, and only at the end of the day when they returned from school. He spent entire nights in the studio with the Dion family. He was like a man possessed. And though Celine's career was taking off, Rene's personal life was falling apart. Anne, who played a significant role in the transformation and refining of Celine Dion, felt abandoned by her husband as he spent almost every waking moment with the teenager. She felt that he had neglected their 2 children. They write, Anne was seeing almost nothing of her husband, who was completely immersed in his work. Things were becoming acrimonious between the couple. Fed up with her husband's neglect, Anne had an affair with a man named Michel in February of 1985. Shortly after the affair, Anne filed for divorce, which enraged Rene. In her official divorce documents, she detailed the alleged following incident. Quote, "After my day's work, at about 3:30, I came home where the children were with their governess. It was only towards midnight that Rene entered, when I was in bed. He woke me up and began a violent domestic scene, absolutely refusing to let me go to sleep. When his harassment became more and more persistent, I had to phone the police, for I was afraid of being physically abused. After a first visit from the police, who seemed to have restored calm, I went back to bed. But he recommenced his harassment and violence and abused me physically, striking me several times, so that I had to call the police again. As a result, I had to leave the original home under police protection at around 2:30 in the morning with my children to take refuge in my mother's home." The split between Rene and Anne would last briefly, as they would soon reconcile. Their reconciliation wouldn't last long, with Anne filing for divorce from Rene for the second time on December 15, 1985. Celine's career at the time had much success. She won several awards, received constant play on the radio, and all seemed well. But in 1986, Celine's latest album hadn't performed that well, so her label TransCanada refused to fund another one. Humiliated and upset, Rene began sifting through newspaper articles and clippings and realized that Celine needed a makeover, from head to toe. He came to the conclusion that they needed to get rid of the childlike image and make her into a woman.
Celine Dion. She's a big star in France and in her home province of Quebec. She isn't known at all in English Canada, but the young singer could change all that soon.
She wanted to change her look, change her style.
Critics in France and Quebec have called her extraordinary, exceptional, a new international star.
To initiate this process, Rene founded a company called Feeling on Celine's 18th birthday, March 30th, 1986. Her new contract would now give her a 50% cut, but in order to introduce a new Celine to the public, numerous changes would have to be made. Rene would make Celine go on a 1-year hiatus, a break they would call her sabbatical year. Rene needed money to fund Celine's next album now that her record label wouldn't do it. To get this money, he would go back to gambling. While he spent that year in Vegas, he made and lost a lot of money, but he earned enough to fund her next project. Celine wouldn't know about Rene's dire financial situation, as he always presented himself as a high roller. Celine said, quote, "Since we first met Rene, he always behaved like a millionaire with class, elegance, and a lot of intelligence, and my mother liked that." During her 1-year hiatus, Celine would take English classes as Rene made it clear that in order to break into the American market, she couldn't just sing English songs. She needed to speak it. They write. So Celine went to Berlitz, 9 hours a day, 5 days a week for months. Celine felt as though she was drowning. She couldn't understand anything. She stuttered and stammered, and her ideas got mixed up. But then, little by little, very slowly, everything became clear, and she found herself speaking English. During Celine's hiatus, several rumors began to spread about the teen. There were stories claiming that Celine had entered into a convent because she was pregnant and having a baby in a secret location. They claimed that she would give the baby up for adoption to some woman in Switzerland. Of course, none of this was true. What was true, according to Celine, was that she was in love and wanted to improve her image and become a sensuous woman. They write, "She was madly in love with the man who had been fashioning her life for the past few years and who wanted to push her all the way to the top. Celine is a grateful person. She thought of the life she would have had without him. In fact, that was the only thing she thought about, and she wanted to prove her gratitude to him by becoming a desirable, sexy, fascinating woman he'd be unable to resist."
You start at 12 years old. They see you. If they like you, they still want to see you at 12 and 13. They don't want to see you growing up. Changing your hair, getting sexier. Where's our little girl?
Ton grand problème, je me souviens, c'était ça,
oui,
ton sourire.
Oui, oui. J'avais carrément les canines très, très, très hautes ici. Et j'étais pas vraiment très bien dans ma peau, pour être franche avec toi. J'étais quand même assez grande. J'étais quand même assez maigre aussi. J'avais un teint un peu olive.
Tu avais un problème, tu dis que tu n'avais pas tes cheveux parce que tu avais tendance à friser, tu ne sais pas comment te coiffer.
Oui, un peu laineux. J'avais l'air comme une petite pauvre. J'étais très heureuse, mais j'avais l'impression que mon bonheur ne se reflétait pas dans mon physique et dans mon visage. Et j'ai probablement, comme toutes les adolescentes, on a un petit peu de difficulté à passer la phase de l'adolescence, justement. Est-ce qu'on est femme? Est-ce qu'on est encore bébé? On veut se faire prendre au sérieux, on n'a pas d'expérience. Mais sincèrement, c'est sûr que c'est vrai que je me trouvais pas belle du tout.
After Celine's one-year hiatus, she secured a major deal with CBS to produce her album Incognito. When her album came out in 1987, it was met with rave reviews and took off in Quebec. Wasting no time, Rene began negotiating the budget for Celine's first English album. Initially, he was only given $30,000, but after watching Celine perform at the Junos, the company gave him an unlimited budget to record the album. Professionally, things were moving forward for Celine, and her future entering into the American market looked very promising. Personally, things were about to take a huge shift in her life. After winning the Eurovision competition in 1988, the relationship between Rene and Celine would go a step further. They write, everybody in Celine's orbit knew she had been in love with Rene since 1986, and perhaps even 1985. She had at first been attracted to the unhappy, lonely, distraught man he was after the separation from Anne. Her maternal instinct compelled her to draw closer to a man who was suffering, to shelter and protect him, and never do him any further harm. At 17 or 18, Celine was going through what has been called a nurse complex and was attracted by the child in Rene Angelil, a child who acted grown up in front of the media. Celine no longer believed in this image he projected. She preferred the man she was beginning to discover, imagine, and desire.
I'm sorry, sir. My manager is not here now.
Je l'ai vu pas tellement dans cette année-là. Puis effectivement, quand on a recommencé à travailler sur le nouveau disque qui était Incognito, avec le nouveau look, puis j'ai vu une autre personne, moi aussi, comme le public.
Saviez-vous que vous étiez amoureux?
Non, pas. Mais j'étais amoureux de son talent, ça c'est certain, depuis le premier jour. Je savais pas à ce moment-là que j'étais amoureux d'elle, mais je la regardais plus de la même façon, disons. Ça me travaillait, ouais. Moi, j'étais séparé à l'époque. J'étais seul. Mais je me disais, ça n'a pas d'allure, tu sais, c'est pas... J'essayais de m'enlever ça n'a pas de bon sens. Et c'est arrivé comme ça un jour où on était en Irlande, justement.
Rene Angelil would detail in Celine's official biography the exact moment they confessed their feelings to one another. He said, quote, "After her physical transformation in 1986, I no longer saw Celine in the same light. I found her physically attractive, but I controlled myself, trying not to think about it. I thought I would damage Celine's career, that I was too old and that people would never forgive me." In Celine's official biography, the author writes, quote, "Every evening since the first tour they did together in 1985, he would kiss her on each cheek and wish her good night. And now on this night of fame and triumph, he was about to leave without kissing her. He had already opened the door and smiled. She came across and clung to him. 'You didn't kiss me, Rene Angelil,' she said as she kept her head and eyes down. He didn't understand what had happened, even though for some weeks he had been thinking about such a scene and imagining it 100 times. He leaned towards her and kissed her on the lips and neck and clutched her in his arms. Then he abruptly relaxed his embrace and fled back to his room. She was speechless for a moment, her heart beating. It was she who called him back. She said, 'If you don't come back, I'll come knocking on your door.'"
When did things change?
It changed. We were in Dublin in 1988. And it was a different kiss goodnight.
You were 20?
I was 20 years old. That's right. I started to, after this Kiss Goodnight in Dublin on the lips for the first time, my whole body started to shake. And then I said to myself, well, maybe that's love. Maybe that's the thing.
Rene is 26 years older than you.
That's right.
At what point did you realize that you were in love with this woman?
1988, it changed. And I realized that I felt good when I was with Celine.
One day, I don't know, I just became a grown-up child, and he was a free man, and it was just different.
You weren't a child anymore.
I was not a child anymore.
I was afraid of what, her parents would say, her family that put their trust in me, actually.
Rene would keep his feelings for Celine a secret, only telling his children and Eddie Marnay. But because a woman's intuition is so strong, as well as motherly instincts, he couldn't hide how he felt for Celine from her mother. They write, Celine's mother was no longer expected to accompany the couple during their travels, now that Celine had turned 18. But as any good mother would, she noticed her daughter's ardent passion, and early on was unable to accept this relationship. She wanted a younger husband for her daughter, a man without children of his own, and one without a past. She viewed Rene as a businessman, an ambitious producer, the best person to propel her daughter to the top, but certainly not as a lover. Mrs. Dion found Rene to be a deeply disturbed man.
Comme on voit dans les films. Le cœur n'a pas d'âge, puis c'est arrivé. Tant mieux.
Votre mère, première réaction?
Aïe. Oui.
Pas évident, hein?
Non. Ça n'a pas été évident. Et
elle devait le soupçonner quand même un peu. Elle devait s'en douter, là.
Une mère, c'est une mère, là. Je pense qu'elle sent les vibrations plus que nous autres, on peut les ressentir, nous autres. Mais elle n'était pas d'accord avec ça, évidemment. Là. Mais ma mère voulait me défendre. Un homme marié, 2 mariages précédents, 3 enfants.
Inquiétant.
Un homme dans le show business. On est là, c'est du travail. Je t'ai fait rencontrer cet homme-là pour travailler. Tu es une jeune fille. Il faut que tu rencontres l'homme parfait, un homme de ton âge. Ou à un moment donné, elle m'a un peu boudée. Elle s'est retirée un peu pour me dire, c'est un signe que je t'envoie, ma fille. C'est pas un homme pour toi, là, regarde, là, je suis pas proche de toi en ce moment.
Rene and Celine would keep their relationship a secret as they prepared for her first English language album. She was ready to blow the world away. On April 2nd, 1990, her album Unison was released. Though the album didn't sell as well as Rene hoped, there was no question that Celine was an impressive talent. In no time, Rene had Celine on tour and making appearances all over Europe, Canada, and North America. Eventually, her single, Where Does My Heart Beat Now, hit the Billboard charts, and her career took off.
Where does my heart beat now? Where is the sound? There's only echoes through the night. Where does my heart beat now? Can't live without the feeling inside.
With Celine's career on the rise, their relationship remained a secret for many years. Reporters and journalists were very curious about Celine's love life and would often ask her if she was dating. She would respond, "Yes, there's someone in my life. Yes, I'm in love with someone like all women my age, but I can't tell you his name." The couple had a secret hand signal to communicate with one another that Celine would frequently do during her appearances. As their relationship progressed, they wouldn't be able to keep their secret for much longer, as Rene was planning to propose. On December 17, 1994, the couple would marry in a very lavish ceremony for all to see. Celine would go on to have an impressive career. In addition, the couple would welcome 3 sons together. It's true, Rene had accomplished all the things he set out to do and made Celine into a global star. But on January 14, 2016, Rene would take his last breath after he passed away from his long battle with throat cancer. Rene's former band member Jean would give readers some insight into what he says is the inevitable and often necessary intimacy that exists between the agent and the artist. He wrote, There's an inevitable and often necessary intimacy that exists between the agent and the artist. They work together. They eat together. They travel together. The agent also has to protect the artist's money, health, and mood, protect her against the hazards of the job, and above all, bad influences. The tension is enormous, the responsibilities overwhelming, and in addition, he has to live with the constant fear of losing his artist. In such circumstances, it would have been difficult for Rene and Celine to not fall in love, particularly since Rene was seen as a genuine hero in Celine's eyes, and that for her part, the singer becoming more and more breathtaking from one performance to the next. They had a great deal of mutual admiration and trust. It was something Rene had been very careful to avoid during Celine's adolescent years, but no one can deny that he was possessive and unwilling to share his protégé with anyone. Celine had very few boyfriends. First, there had been a boy in her hometown, and then the hockey player Gilbert, whom she met while filming her first video. When Rene heard about Celine's attraction towards Gilbert, he exploded. He went into a real fit, very akin to a fit of jealousy. He could never permit another man to interfere with his plans. He could never admit that Celine might fall in love and experience a great passion while he was struggling to build up her career. Rene had pushed any male presence in Celine's life out of the way. He pushed her manager Paul out of the way. He put a stop to any budding romances and never allowed male fans to get too close. It is hardly surprising that Celine didn't have any love affairs before being united with Rene, for he had created a vacuum around her and knowingly driven off any potential suitors. Rene constantly remembered how his previous artist, Ginette Renew, allowed her boyfriend to interfere. Never again did he want to experience that humiliation. There's nothing worse for an artist's agent, whether Rene or someone else, than to see his artist fall in love. Then and there, the agent loses all control over his protégé. In some cases, it can be catastrophic. The artist becomes less available, separates herself, and a certain bond of trust with the agent is broken. Love often makes people lose their heads. The story of Celine Dion and Rene Angelil is often described as a tale as old as time, a true love story of soulmates who were destined to be together. A fairy tale. But is it?
What do you miss most at this moment? What's the hardest part going forward without Rene?
So what's hard, I have to say that when I have to take decisions now.
Do you ever say, what would Rene do?
I think we all do. Do you think Rene would think that this is too décolleté? Do you think Rene would think that this song is appropriate? But after a while, am I going to have signs all the time? Or do I have to make decisions as a woman, as a mother, as an artist?
Are you ready for that?
Do I have a choice? You're never ready for something like this to happen. Even though you expect it, when it hits you, you're not prepared.